My son's teacher called him a liar when he said his dad works at NASA. What happened at Parents' Night left her speechless. I, 38M, never thought I'd be writing one of these posts, but here I am, still processing what happened last week. My son is in 4th grade, and he's always been fascinated by space. Ever since he was little, he'd point up at the stars and ask question after question. When he learned what NASA was, his eyes lit up like nothing I'd ever seen before. For context, I've worked at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory for almost 15 years now. I'm part of the engineering team that works on propulsion systems for deep space missions. It's not glamorous like being an astronaut, but it's challenging work that I love, and my son has always been proud of what I do. Last month, my son came home from school unusually quiet. My wife noticed it first during dinner. When we asked what was wrong, he just shrugged it off, but we could tell something was bothering him. After some gentle prodding, he finally opened up. Mrs. K said I was making things up, he mumbled, pushing his food around on his plate. Making what up? I asked. That you work for NASA, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. We had to talk about our parents' jobs for career day, and when I said you help build rockets at NASA, she said I was lying to get attention. My wife and I exchanged glances. I felt my temperature rising, but kept my cool for my son's sake. Did she say that in front of the class? My wife asked, her voice tight. He nodded, and my heart sank. She said NASA engineers don't live here. They live in Florida or Houston. She said I should be honest instead of making up stories. I was furious, but I didn't want to undermine his teacher completely. Sometimes people don't know about JPL in California, I explained. But she shouldn't have called you a liar without checking first. The next day, I emailed his teacher requesting a meeting during the upcoming Parents' Night. Her response was polite but dismissive, saying she was looking forward to clearing up some misunderstandings about career day. Parents' Night arrived, and my wife insisted on coming along. I'm not missing this, she said as we drove to the school. I could tell she was as angry as I was, but trying to stay composed. The classroom was decorated with space-themed posters, which felt ironic given the circumstances. Mrs. K, a woman probably in her 50s with reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, greeted us with a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you for coming, she said, gesturing to the small chairs in front of her desk. I understand there was some confusion about career day. Actually, I said calmly, there seems to be a misunderstanding on your part. My son told you I work for NASA, which is absolutely true. She tilted her head slightly. I've been teaching for 27 years, and I've heard all sorts of stories from children. I find it's best to encourage honesty rather than fantasy. My wife shifted in her seat, but remained quiet, letting me handle it as we'd agreed. I understand the importance of honesty, I replied, reaching for my work badge. But in this case, my son was being entirely truthful. I'm a propulsion engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. I handed her my badge, complete with the NASA logo and my photo ID. Her expression changed slightly, but she wasn't convinced. JPL? That's NASA? She asked, examining the badge. I thought NASA was just in Florida and Texas. NASA has facilities across the country, I explained. JPL is managed by Caltech for NASA. We work on robotic space missions, including the Mars rovers and various deep space probes. She handed back the badge, her certainty visibly wavering. I wasn't aware. But surely you understand why it seemed unlikely. What seems unlikely is that you would publicly call a child a liar without doing any verification. My wife finally spoke up, her voice controlled but firm. A simple question or a quick internet search would have prevented humiliating our son in front of his peers. Mrs. K flushed. I wouldn't say I humiliated him. You told him he was lying for attention, I interrupted. In front of the entire class. How do you think that made him feel? The teacher fell silent, seemingly processing the situation. After a moment, she sighed. You're right. I should have handled it differently. I apologize. We're not the ones who need the apology, my wife pointed out. Of course, Mrs. K nodded. I'll speak with him tomorrow and correct the misunderstanding with the class. I shook my head. A private apology isn't enough. You publicly questioned his honesty, so the correction should be just as public. We discussed how she would address it, and she eventually agreed to not only apologize to our son, but also to use the opportunity for a mini lesson on NASA's various facilities around the country. As we were about to leave, I had an idea. Actually, would you be interested in having me come in for a proper career day talk? I could bring some approved materials from JPL. The kids might enjoy learning about the Mars missions. The change in her demeanor was immediate. Her eyes widened, and for the first time that evening, her smile seemed genuine. That would be incredible. The children would love that. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in front of 25 fascinated 4th graders. I'd brought along NASA-approved handouts, a small model of the Perseverance rover, and video clips of our missions that had been cleared for public viewing. The children were full of questions, their hands shooting up faster than I could call on them. But what meant the most to me was seeing my son's face. The pride in his eyes as I explained what we do at JPL made all the frustration worth it. Mrs. K stood at the back of the classroom, genuinely engaged and occasionally asking thoughtful questions herself. After the presentation, she thanked me profusely. I made a serious error in judgment, she admitted. I've learned an important lesson about not making assumptions and doing my research before challenging a student's statement. My son has been different since then, more confident, more engaged with school. Last week, he told me he wants to work at JPL someday too. Whether that happens or not doesn't matter. What matters is that he knows his word is respected and his dreams are valid. As for Mrs. K, she's been surprisingly humble throughout the whole experience. She's even organized a space-themed unit for next month and asked if I could help review some of the materials for accuracy. I guess the moral of this story is that sometimes standing up for your child doesn't have to be combative. Sometimes it can turn into an opportunity for growth, not just for your kid, but for the adults involved too. And occasionally, it even leads to a classroom full of children getting really excited about space exploration, which in my book is always a win.